Hello and welcome to POLYCOSM. My name is Christina and this is the first video of a series we are calling Design Principles. In this two-part episode, Omercan and I will talk about the importance of reference, how we personally use reference in our professional workflow, where to find reference, is realism the ultimate goal, and right and wrong ways of using reference. This video is going to be a bit of a long one, so I've attached timestamps on screen and in the comments below. Feel free to jump forward to whichever topic interests you the most. What you're seeing on screen right now is a 31-day sculpting challenge I'm currently doing, where I'll be speed sculpting something new for every day of May. For each sculpt, I'm relying heavily on reference in order to learn, so I thought this backdrop would be perfect for this video. Now, where do I personally stand on using reference in my work? Actually, I'm a huge proponent of using reference, as you've probably seen in all my other videos released so far on this channel. I'm also a very literal thinker and never approach any piece of artwork without reference. You might not know this about me, but I have a bit of a weird condition called aphantasia, which is basically the inability to conjure up imagery in your mind's eye. So if I tell you to close your eyes and visualize an apple in your mind's eye, this might either be super easy or super hard depending on where you are on that scale. Well, personally, I can barely visualize anything, which I actually only found out about a little over a year ago. I thought everyone saw what I saw or, well, didn't see. This has always been a huge obstacle in my creative journey, as I found it nearly impossible to just sketch or paint freely without a huge library of reference in front of me. So what I've been doing for years is trying to find creative ways of bridging that knowledge gap, whether it was using posable dolls, taking lots of pictures of myself for reference, super basic blockouts in SketchUp, photobashing, you name it, I've tried it all. And it wasn't until I discovered Blender that I actually finally felt at home. Here was a tool that allowed me to just be super creative without hindrance, and it has completely changed the direction of my work. Only for the past 2 years have I really started using 3D as a way to fill that gap, and I highly advise any 2D artist to learn any 3D software as a reference tool. How, you ask? Well, using this piece as an example from this simple setup that took me just a few hours to put together, I was able to gain lots of lighting and shadow information, how forms overlap and behave, what happens when things further back recede in the distance, accurate perspective, how materials react to certain lighting, and color information. I can go on and on and on regarding what a single render in Blender can provide in terms of information, but you get the point. It doesn't even have to be this complicated. Look at this scene with just rectangles and other primitive shapes, even from this extremely basic render where no modeling skills is required, you still learn a lot of information. So if you really want to gain a deep understanding of how things work in a technical way, try learning Blender. It's free and super easy to learn. There's just so much educational content out there. On POLYCOSM's main page, I have a list of recommended channels to learn from if you're interested. As mentioned earlier, I just recently started picking up sculpting as a way to expand my 3D knowledge and provide even more creative freedom when working in Blender. The way I've approached learning this new skill is by equipping myself with lots and lots of reference. I'm primarily a 2D artist, so I'm used to working with 2D imagery, but suddenly thinking about how this character I drew would look in a dynamic pose from all angles, that's a whole other ballgame. That's where reference comes into play, and how crucial it is that you learn to dissect the reference, learn to simplify the shapes you're seeing in front of you, and being able to recreate that exact form in 3D. If you're watching this and thinking, I'm a 2D artist, how does all of this apply to me? Well, I believe all artistic skills are transferable. If you learn 3D and about form in 3-dimensional space, this will reflect in your 2D artwork. Heck, it might even teach you about form much faster than just painting for hours and hours on end. Here's an example of how I regularly work and combine the best of both worlds. I often use DAS models in my work, which I have a tutorial on, just follow the link on the screen, and use that lighting information in combination with the photo reference, and here's the result. Pay attention to the fact that I use the logic of light already established in this 3D render, while figuring out how to place the proportions of this model in the photo. I tend to do a mix of 3D, photobashing, and overpainting, and as you can see, after the overpaint, the model's face now feels like it belongs in the image because it's adhering to the rules of light established in the render. You can almost use 3D as a cheat sheet. It reduces the amount of guesswork you have to do, freeing up more time to focus on the things you actually like doing and are passionate about. So, where do you find decent reference? And I'm not talking about what website to search on or which terms to search for. I think everyone knows that. I wanted to approach this video in a more thinking outside the box kind of way. We all know the typical sources such as Google, stock photo websites, Gumroad, QBrush, ArtStation reference packs, using your own photo references, photobash.org, Pinterest, and books. But here are some alternative sources you might not have considered or even heard of. Let's start off with just pure 3D. I use DAS Studio, which is free, as a way to pose all my models in all of my work involving people. You can custom pose models, change their body shape and limbs, and have the muscles actually contract and expand, and add facial expressions. And once I'm done with posing models, I import them right into Blender. I primarily use Blender as a scene composer, where I figure out the set dressing, add in the lights, texture my models, and then compose a final render, which I then paint over. If you're interested in how Blender can be used as a reference tool, skip to this timestamp earlier. What is great about Blender is really the community and the amazing tools they develop. Check out this handy tool called Simply Cloth, which allows you to simulate cloth, sew clothing together, and even choose a type of cloth material. Another tool I use all the time is Extreme PBR Evo Texture, which gives you just a ton of presets you can use to easily texture objects without the hassle of unwrapping, which we all know everyone hates. And this alone can teach you a lot about texture and how light interacts with certain textures, because with the textures you also get a displacement map, so you can literally see how light interacts with the texture surface, which is really cool. If you're into mocap, animation, etc., Mixamo is an amazing online tool that allows you to import models, have them auto-rigged, and just play any animation out of the huge library available. You can also then export the models and import them into Blender with the animation included. Just amazing. Sketchfab is a 3D library that contains a lot of free models that you can turn around in the 3D viewer, which is really cool. Sometimes I use models to understand form better. For example, when I'm drawing something very complicated and I just don't have the time to fully model the thing in 3D. In the next video, Omercan will talk about how he uses the 3D viewer to aid his storyboarding, for example. Also, a little shameless plug. On the POLYCOSM Sketchfab store, you can find all of the models I've been creating for my 31-day sculpting challenge. Most of them are free to download, and the paid ones are super cheap. Lastly, similar to Blender, SketchUp is another free 3D tool that is great for architectural related stuff. Your phone or tablet can also provide a lot of great reference in the form of apps. For my iPad, I often use Handy, which is a lighting referencing software where you can choose animal skulls, human heads, feet, and even hands that you can pose. You can rotate the lights around, change the intensity and temperature, etc. Super handy software. Get it? Okay, now that most of you have clicked off, if you're in a pinch or on the go, Artpose FE and ME and Magic Poser is an amazing character posing software. You can choose different builds, add in some lighting, and pose characters. I used to use this all the time at the start of my freelancing career, where I was primarily working on my iPad. Last of phone and tablet apps is Displayland, which is a 3D scanning software where you can scan a subject or environment from just your phone or tablet. If you want to learn more about that, I've already made a video about that, so just follow the link on screen if you're interested in that. Getting into reference in terms of just color, K-Gamut is an awesome little software that analyzes any image you drop in and will give you a limited palette overview as well as the value range of an image. This is excellent for analyzing pieces of artwork from, for example, artists you love, so you can easily understand what makes their artwork unique to them. Here are some studies of pieces I absolutely love. As you can see, I gained a lot of information from K-Gamut, which I used as a way to dissect the piece in detail. For every little revelation I had after a study like this, I was able to put that little wisdom nugget towards my next piece. Color Constructor is similar to using Blender for color information, but is more of a standalone software that allows you to pick the local colors of an object, say an off-white dress, and see how that dress would look in, for example, a sunset lighting scenario or under moonlight. If you're doing a whole scene, you can just choose a lighting setup here, change some local colors around, and you basically have a whole color palette figured out for you. No need to play an endless guessing game. Now for the more interesting sources of reference falling under the umbrella of design and AI-generated reference, Brainstorm. This is a software where you primarily work with silhouettes and is excellent for hard surface designs like mechs, guns, etc. You can randomly generate shapes and even turn on this rendered mode that allows you to see the shapes as rendered objects. If you've ever worked with silhouettes before, you know how powerful this could be. NVIDIA Gauguin, I think that's how you pronounce it, is a software that allows you to draw in super primitive paint with a specific property you want, like water or land, and it will automatically generate a painting for you. This is all AI based and makes me scared for the future. And check this one out. Artbreeder is an online website that lets you combine images. The AI tries to analyze the faces of two characters, and through a slider you can crossbreed the faces. You can get some pretty wacky results from this. How crazy is it though that this is possible? It's insane. So this is similar to Artbreeder, but is more for just pure head and face reference. This person does not exist.com is a website that will show you a new head or face every time you reload the page. And as the name suggests, these are AI generated, so you don't have to worry about any copyright issues while using the photos. Last one here is maybe a tool you haven't heard of, namely this animal skull tool, which lets you spin an animal skull of your choice, for example canine, and once you've settled on a perspective, say you need a top-down view of it, voila! It will find images that matches the head positioning as close as it can. This is extremely useful for any kind of illustration work. This tool is a bit hard to find by searching, so I'll list a link in the description below. Next on the list is scans and catalog, and there are many websites that provide very useful scans. Sketchfab is an obvious one, but if you're looking for more historical and architectural based scans, Google Arts and Culture Scans will have you covered. If you're looking for anatomy scans, Anatomy 360 has amazing high quality scans of full body people, heads, hands, etc. You can change the rendering style, the lighting, colors, etc. Really useful tool for all the anatomy nerds out there. Ooh, and this one I really like. Moviescreencaps.com is a huge library of high quality screen caps from big blockbuster movies. Perfect for studying a movie's color palette or doing a screen cap study, etc. Just pick a movie and you'll see they've basically screen capped frames of the movies and listed them in chronological order. Last on this list is New York Times Fashion Runway Collections, which has a huge catalogue on runway fashion, and there's a lot of interesting reference to look at there, especially if you're really into character design or just fashion design in general. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to the reference tools such as PureRef, which is a standalone software that allows you to drop references in a floating window, which you can then move around freely, size up or down, etc. It's completely free and probably the best referencing software out there, to be honest. But yeah, that's pretty much the end of my list of recommendations and what tools I use in my workflows, so let's move on to the next point. So why is reference important? Well, I believe reference is a very important aspect in regards to visual library. There is a problem with our visual memory and the way we perceive memories because we mainly remember the gist only. Or in my case, I can't really retain visual imagery at all. Omercan is a very good advocate for practicing these skills on a regular basis, so if you're interested in hearing more about how he approaches that in a more practical manner, make sure to tune in for next week's video. So with all this talk of reference, is realism the ultimate goal then? Here's a quote from 3D artist Ken Trammell, which I found to be very true. Realism is definitely not the holy grail, but in digital art, it provides a standard against which we measure the skill behind somebody's work. I prefer the term believability, which leaves more room for individual creativity. A supernatural beast cannot be realistic, strictly speaking, because it's not real. But if you use the right reference to give it believable proportions and textures, your audience will happily make the leap of faith and imagine that it really exists. I feel this perfectly encapsulates the importance of reference, even if your work is stylized and especially if the subject does not exist. In our previous video Zero Call, link on screen, Omercan combined lizards, fennec foxes, rabbits, jerboas, and even cacti in his process of coming up with our little critter. He used the logic of anatomy and pieced things together, and the result in the end was something entirely unique and different from a lot of already existing creatures. We've finally reached the last stretch of this video. Kudos to you if you've stuck until the end. I really appreciate it. So what are the right and wrong ways of using reference? Well, if you fall too far on the end of this scale, you know you're kinda in the danger zone. You can either be relying too heavily on reference by, for example, photobashing and failing to paint over it enough for it to be just another part of the image, or you can fall on the opposite spectrum and end up refusing to follow reference because it's my style. Don't be that person. The problem with heavy photobashing or tracing without a good art foundation to back up its usage, you might end up relying too much on photos to put an illustration together. This often comes from a place of insecurity and not knowing the fundamentals and or refusing to face reality. I am 100% guilty of this crime. In the beginning of my art career, I couldn't put together a single illustration without throwing in lots of images. And because my skills were so lacking in terms of fundamentals, the lighting did not match at all. The image got too busy, overcrowded, and mismatched, and it was just a complete mess. If you add in a lot of images, all with different light sources, the result might look extremely disjointed, and the image will portray a lot of contradicting information. I still use a lot of photos today, but more as a reference or a way to add detail to underlying form. I don't start from a photo and build from there, but rather add photos towards the end of an illustration process to further push the level of details. A good rule of thumb is, if you only use photos in small sections as a part of a bigger composition, you're probably in the safe zone. If the photo dictates a big part of the image, you might be in violation of copyright, unless you own the photo, of course. Legally, there is no percentage of a photo that you can use, but generally though, if you cannot tell that the piece you created came from the photograph, you should be safe. Another art sin would be to trace. Now, tracing in itself can be an excellent learning tool to develop muscle memory and get yourself comfortable with the act of drawing. Or if you're studying anatomy, for instance, understanding form and how everything's built and put together. I'd primarily advise to use tracing as a learning tool rather than something to put into actual practice when working in a professional capacity. Here's an example of how I trace using grease pencil when I'm sculpting in Blender to understand the form. For example, with the sorting hat, the folds were really difficult to kind of guess by eye, so I used the grease pencil tool to trace over and then try to match my sculpt to that tracing. Note how I specifically only use this method to match the proportions and make my life a little easier. So what does count as stealing? Art theft is extremely serious and should not be taken lightly. As mentioned earlier, using someone else's work, photographs included, as a big part of your image definitely crosses that line. Unless prior permission is given from the artist, of course. When working in Blender, I use a plugin that connects the software to the Sketchfab store, and you can browse and import models really easily. I am in love with this plugin. But pay attention to the license section, as it will give you a description telling you in what sense you can use the model. I won't bore you with the details, but here's a brief list of all the licenses, starting from most free at the top to least free at the bottom. Follow these guidelines and you should be safe. I pretty much follow the same rule here as mentioned earlier. If the model is just going to be a barely noticeable background element, I use a lot of Sketchfab assets. However, if it is a custom design model and you can tell the artist has put a lot of work into it, I would not use it as a big proponent of my image unless the license states I can do so. So just be careful while kit bashing here. The last topic I wanted to touch on here was what makes something a bad reference versus a good reference. Poor reference has 1, bad lighting, although in this second example, the reference might be perfect for sculpting details, for example. 2, is heavily edited and airbrushed, and this is because we try to remove imperfections, and doing that, we're not kind of seeing the realistic version of the subject. 3 has artificial studio lighting, although this isn't always bad, but normally, unless you have good painting skills, these type of references come across as very unnatural and sterile sometimes. 4, blurry or grainy images where you can't really make out any detail. And 5 is someone else's work. And here is an excellent example where the artist has used someone else's work in their own work and used it as the main subject of the image. And this is definitely plagiarizing. As a 2D and 3D artist, I've found that the best way to use reference, once I've found a good source, is to combine the best of both worlds. Information from the render with the design of the image. Here's another example of a piece I showed earlier where I got a lot of great lighting information from my Blender render and just wanted to implement this woman's face in. I mixed and matched while following the lighting logic already established, and this is the final result. I pretty much work this way for most of my illustrations, and in this way I can use photos without directly plagiarizing, as I'm changing a lot of the properties of the image and it doesn't dictate a large portion of my illustration, like in the last example of using someone else's work. If all of this information feels a bit overwhelming and you're not too sure how to approach the world of reference, the little piece of advice I can offer is to focus on one thing at a time. Too often we artists are in a rush to learn everything and apply everything at once, but I've personally found that dedicating 1 or 2 goals to each new painting or sculpt or model is a much faster way to learn. Here's a few examples. In this piece, my goal was to tell a compelling story through mystery using lighting and the lack thereof to tell that story. I remember looking at black and white movies to understand how they used lights to tell a compelling story. In this other illustration, I wanted body language to be a big focus in order to tell my story, so looking up reference of people arguing and fighting was a big focus in order to create that tension. In this last example, I wanted to learn from Simon Stollenhag's way of limiting a value range, like in this image, and here's a study I did trying to dissect his work. After understanding his method a bit better, I created my piece and was really happy with the result. So try to see each piece of artwork as a way to learn one thing. And after, say, 10 paintings or sculpts, for example, you've learned 10 things, and all of your previously stored nuggets of wisdom will transfer to your next painting. And if you just keep doing that, you'll really see yourself improving fast. So you can see using reference really is the best way of improving. Never stop learning. Oh, this was a long one. If you watched it all, you are my hero. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and really, if you have any other topics or questions you'd like discussed or answered, feel free to drop that in the comments below. Next week, Omercan will discuss his take on reference in terms of 2D image making and approach the video with lots of demonstrations and examples, so make sure to tune in for that. Bye!